The cold bit to the bone, despite our layers of clothing. The dampness of the last few days, mixed with the sudden biting frost, had turned our camp into a dreary sight. Fourth day, deep in the wilds of northern Wisconsin, and game was scarce as hen's teeth. A couple of scrawny rabbits and one missed doe. That was the extent of our haul. Dave, as usual, grumbled the loudest, kicking a frost-covered stump near the dying campfire. "Damn this hellhole," he barked, shaking frost from his thick mustache. 45 years I've been hunting. Never seen it this bad. Maybe all the game's died off here, eh, Mike? I shrugged, tossing a few more branches onto the fire. The flames reluctantly licked at the damp wood. "It's a big forest, Dave. Just bad luck." Pushing 40, I'd learned patience over 15 years of hunting. But even my patience was wearing thin. Something was wrong with this forest. Too quiet. For the second day now, we hadn't heard woodpeckers or jays. Even the squirrels had vanished. Usually, the forest breathes with sound, but here, a vacuum, as if nature itself was holding its breath before something. Chris, the youngest of us, about 25, nervously huddled in his new camo down jacket. This was his third or fourth serious trip out, and the lack of success, combined with the oppressive silence, was clearly getting to him. He kept shivering, casting anxious glances into the thicket of darkening pines. "Maybe we should head back? Weather's turning, look, sky's clouding over." Dave snorted. "Quit your whining. Man up, kid. We'll wait out the storm, and tomorrow our luck will turn. Can't go back empty-handed, they'll laugh us out of town." George, our oldest and most taciturn companion, over 50, just silently stirred the embers with a stick. He'd grown up around here, knew these woods like the back of his hand. His quiet nature always commanded respect, but now his stern, weathered face seemed unusually grim. He looked up at the low gray sky and uttered a single word: "Whiteout." As if on cue, the wind suddenly intensified, howling through the treetops, hurling the first stinging pellets of snow into our faces. 10 minutes later, the world shrank to a few yards of white, furiously swirling chaos. Snow fell in a solid wall, visibility dropped to zero. We instinctively huddled together. "We gotta get out of here," Dave yelled over the wind. But where? The trail vanished under instantly deepening drifts. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly, uselessly. "What the hell?" I muttered, shaking it. Dave grabbed his same story. "Magnetic anomaly? Out here?" he stammered disbelievingly. George shook his head, his gaze heavy. "Not magnetic? Something else?" Panic began to creep in. Disoriented, caught in a fierce blizzard, compasses useless, miles from our ATVs. The cold intensified minute by minute. The wind cut right through us, icy needles scouring our faces. Chris started whimpering softly from cold and fear. Even Dave lost his bravado, looking around uncertainly. We moved blindly, hoping to find some shelter, a rock face or a dense stand of pines. Progress was slow, wading through snow up to our knees, sometimes deeper. At one point, I stumbled, catching myself on a tree trunk. Looking up, I shone my flashlight. A thick branch, maybe 6 inches in diameter, was snapped clean off like a matchstick, at least 10 feet off the ground. The fresh break gleamed white against the dark bark. Nearby, another one, just like it, too high for a moose or bear, too thick for any storm to snap so cleanly. A chill unrelated to the cold went down my spine. Dave saw it too and whistled low. Some wind? But I saw his eyes. He knew it wasn't the wind either. George followed our gazes, his lips tightening into a thin line. We trudged on for another hour, exhausted. The cold stiffened our limbs, Fingers and toes went numb. And then, through the roaring blizzard and the veil of snow, I saw it. A dim, yellowish rectangle of light cutting through the storm. Or was I imagining things? "Look!" I yelled, pointing with a frozen hand. The others peered intently. Yes, it was real. The faint outline of a structure and a weak glimmer. A cabin. Hope flared like a burning ember. Whoever was there, it was a chance to survive the storm. We lunged towards the saving light, fatigue forgotten. Closer, we saw a dilapidated, snow-drifted hunting cabin. Old, clearly abandoned, but a light truly flickered in the window, maybe a kerosene lamp or candle. Strange, this cabin wasn't on any of our maps, not even the detailed ones. But now wasn't the time for questions. Salvation was at hand. The door, made of rough, time-darkened planks, wasn't locked. It yielded with a long, rusty groan, letting us in along with a swirl of snow. The first thing that hit us was the smell, stale, musty air thick with the scent of old wood, mouse droppings, and something else. Something unpleasantly familiar, animalistic, like wet dog left in the damp. And beneath it all, a faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang, the smell of dried blood. Inside was only marginally warmer than outside, but at least the wind couldn't reach us. The cabin was small, one room, maybe 20 feet square, a crudely built table, a couple of benches, 2 sets of bunk beds against one wall, and a cast-iron pot-belly stove in the corner. Cold embers lay dark in the stove. Someone had been here not long ago, but the fire had died hours back. On the table, remnants of a meager meal, an empty tin can, a dried crust of moldy bread, an overturned tin cup. Dave immediately went to the stove, rattling the poker. "Well, some semblance of civilization. Let's get this going, dry off." Chris pulled off his wet hat with relief, his hair frosted. George silently moved deeper into the room, his eyes carefully scanning every corner. I switched on my powerful flashlight and started looking around more closely. The beam caught deep, parallel gouges on the log wall near the door. They ran from top to bottom, as if something huge had clawed at the door, or from it. I ran a finger along one groove. The wood was torn at least half an inch deep. Claws. Huge claws. No lynx, no wolf, not even a bear would likely leave such even long marks. And creepiest of all, several similar deep scratches were on the inside of the door and the wall next to it, as if someone had tried to hold the door shut from the inside or conversely break it down to get out. "Mike, look here," George called softly. He was standing by one of the bunks in the far corner. I walked over. My flashlight beam hit the floor. Dark, almost black stains, irregular shapes. Blood. One large stain was smeared, as if someone had tried clumsily to wipe it up with a rag, only spreading the grime. From this stain, a trail of distinct drops led directly under the lower bunk. I shone the light under the bed, nothing but dust and old rags. But the mere thought of what had happened here made the hair on my neck prickle. In the center of the room lay an overturned stool. Nearby, shards of glass from a kerosene lamp that lay on its side. Clear signs of a struggle or sudden panic. "What happened here?" Chris whispered, his eyes wide with fear. He'd clearly registered the smell and the tension in the air. Dave, finished with the stove, came over. He frowned at the scratches, then the bloodstains. "Bear, probably," he suggested uncertainly. "Got into the cabin looking for food, maybe someone left supplies. Or maybe it was wounded looking for shelter. Or," he hesitated, "maybe just 2 hunters had a drunken fight. Got into it, one cut the other, hence the blood." The explanation sounded weak, especially looking at those monstrous scratches. A bear wouldn't claw like that. It would just smash the door. And a fight. Too much blood, and the nature of the marks was wrong. My unease grew into a heavy foreboding. This place felt wrong, dangerous. George silently approached the wall, running a calloused finger over the gouges. He said nothing, but his face grew darker than stone. "We need to leave," I said firmly. Chris immediately nodded, but Dave shook his head. "Where? Do you hear that out there?" He gestured to the window where the blizzard raged, transforming the world into a solid white wall. "Going out now is suicide. We wouldn't last 100 yards. At least here we have walls and a stove." Logic was on his side. We really had no choice. We were trapped. "All right," I agreed reluctantly, "but we lock this place down tight, and we take watch in shifts." Dave nodded. On the inside of the door was an old but sturdy-looking latch. We slid it shut with a screech. For good measure, we braced the door with a heavy bench. The windows were small, grimy, one was boarded up. We decided to cover the other one too, hanging an old blanket found on a bunk over it. It got darker, but somehow felt safer. Dave finally got the stove going, and soon a welcome warmth began to spread through the cabin, mingling with the sense of fear and blood. We sat around the fire, trying to warm ourselves and push away the dark thoughts, but the oppressive sense of danger didn't leave. It seemed soaked into the very walls of this cursed refuge. The warmth from the potbelly stove began to drive out the penetrating cold, but it couldn't melt the ice of fear gripping us from within. We sat silently, listening to the furious roar of the storm outside the thin cabin walls. The wind battered the logs like a huge beast trying to get in, howling down the chimney pipe, creating a ghastly, monotonous symphony of destruction. But through this chaos, other sounds began to emerge. First, a distant, barely audible howl, long, low, vibrating on some inhuman note. It wasn't like a wolf's. That's higher, cleaner. This was deeper, guttural, filled with primal anguish and threat. We froze, exchanging glances. Even Dave stopped feeding wood into the stove. Silence, if you could call the storm's roar silence. Then the howl came again. Closer. Much closer. It rolled over the cabin roof, making Chris cry out and shrink into a corner. Something huge and alive was out there in the heart of the whiteout. Then the sounds changed. Added to the wind's howl was a distinct cracking. Branches breaking, thick, dry ones under incredible weight, and then footsteps, heavy, measured steps through the deep snow. Someone or something was circling the cabin, round and round. The snow crunched under its paws or feet, with a steady, relentless rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound would approach the door, pause, then move towards the window. Pause again, continuing around the perimeter. It was studying us, assessing us. Chris, pale as a sheet, crawled to the boarded-up window and tried to peek through a narrow gap between the planks. There are lights," he whispered, his voice trembling. Dave roughly pushed him aside. "Let me see. What lights in this weather?" He pressed his eye to the crack, peering into the swirling snow. "Can't see anything. Darkness and snow. Wait, what's that?" Suddenly, the relative quiet of the footsteps was shattered by the panicked thundering of many hooves. Right past the cabin, emerging from the white mist and vanishing back into it, galloped a herd of deer. Their eyes were wild with terror, sides heaving, steam pluming from their mouths. They bolted headlong, heedless of the path, fleeing something unseen. Following them, smaller shadows flashed by. Foxes, rabbits, even a pair of lynx, all running in the same direction, gripped by a shared, irrational fear. The climax of this strange exodus was an enormous black bear. The master of these woods, normally afraid of nothing, lumbered out from behind the trees. moving with incredible speed for its bulk. It didn't even glance towards the cabin, its small eyes filled with animalistic horror. It charged away, saving its hide from something more terrifying than the storm, hunger, or man. We stared at each other, the same horrifying realization dawning on our faces. The animals weren't fleeing the blizzard. Storms were normal for them. They were fleeing a predator. From whatever was circling our cabin. From whatever made that inhuman howl. From whatever terrified even a massive bear. My heavy foreboding solidified into icy certainty. We were in mortal danger. The creature outside wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something ancient and malevolent. "We have to go," I said hoarsely, my voice barely working. "Right now, before it decides to come in." But Dave, still pale but regaining some of his usual stubbornness, pointed to the blanket-covered window, beyond which the storm raged. "Are you crazy, Mike? Going out there is suicide. We'll freeze in half an hour. At least we're sheltered here. Trapped, yeah, but outside is certain death." He was right. We were locked in this damned cabin like mice in a trap. Outside, the blizzard and an unknown horror. Inside, bloodstains, ghastly scratches, and a suffocating atmosphere of fear. And somewhere very close, just beyond the thin log walls, it prowled and waited. After the animals' panicked flight, relative quiet returned outside, broken only by the ceaseless howl of the wind and the crackle of wood in the stove. But now the silence pressed down even harder. We sat motionless, straining to hear every creak of the old logs, every rustle. Our own ragged, fearful breathing sounded loud in the tense air. Dave nervously fiddled with the handle of his hunting knife. Chris hugged his knees, rocking back and forth, mumbling something incoherent. George sat still as a statue, but his eyes tracked every shadow in the dim cabin. And then I caught it. Another sound. Quiet. Almost lost against the wind, but definitely there. A ragged, intermittent, almost labored breathing. It wasn't coming from us. It was here, inside the cabin. I froze, raising a hand for silence. My heart hammered against my ribs. Dave looked at me questioningly. Chris pulled his head down between his shoulders in fright. George slowly turned his head, his ears also catching the alien, disturbing sound. The breathing was faint, wet, with a sort of bubbling whistle, like someone with a punctured lung. It came from somewhere low, from the same corner with the bunk beds where we'd seen the bloodstains on the floor. We exchanged horrified glances. A terrible suspicion began to form. Whoever left the blood, whoever fought and was wounded, maybe they hadn't left. Maybe they were still here, under us. George slowly stood up, trying not to make a sound. He took my flashlight and carefully shone it towards the corner. The breathing grew slightly clearer as we approached. It came from under the lower bunk. George motioned for Dave and me to help him. The three of us, moving as quietly as possible, pulled the heavy wooden bunk away from the wall. Underneath, amidst the dust and old rags, were crudely fitted planks covering a hole in the floor, a trapdoor, leading to a cellar or crawl space, common in old cabins like this. The planks weren't nailed down, just laid loosely on top, camouflaged with debris. And it was from that black hole that the faint, agonized breathing emanated. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. So in the struggle whose aftermath we saw, someone had been badly wounded and hidden here in the crawl space. And they were still alive. But who? A person? Or something else? Something capable of leaving those monstrous claw marks on the walls? Something that could fight the creature now pacing outside? My thoughts tangled. fear paralyzing me. Chris sobbed quietly behind us. Dave swallowed hard, his face gray. He raised his rifle, checking the action. I did the same. We faced a terrifying dilemma. Open the trapdoor? Peer into the darkness from which that awful breathing came? Come face to face with the unknown, wounded, perhaps dying entity? Or try to barricade the trapdoor better, seal it down there, leaving it to its agony? But what if it got out? What if it wasn't as weak as it sounded? Fear of what lurked below mingled with the primal terror of what roamed outside. Two monsters. One outside, the other beneath our feet. "Don't touch it," Dave whispered, his voice trembling. "Pile the planks back heavier, put something heavy on top. Let's not disturb it." George nodded in agreement. I also thought it was the most sensible, perhaps the only, course of action now. Don't provoke another threat. We carefully replaced the planks, trying not to disturb whatever was below. We piled a couple of heavy logs found near the stove on top and pushed the bunk back as best we could. The breathing became more muffled, but didn't disappear entirely. It remained a constant reminder that we weren't alone in this cursed refuge. We were trapped not just with the storm and the monster outside, but also with something wounded and possibly just as dangerous, breathing right beneath us in the cold, pitch-black darkness of the crawl space. The tension in the cabin reached a boiling point. The very air seemed thick with fear and the anticipation of the inevitable. We had barely moved away from the trapdoor, trying to catch our breath, when a sound from outside froze the blood in our veins. A deafening, furious roar, full of primal malice, shook the cabin to its foundations. It was so powerful the walls trembled, and the flames in the stove leaped, throwing out a shower of sparks. Immediately following the roar came an impact. A heavy, crushing blow against the door. The wood splintered. The old latch groaned pitifully, but held for now. We recoiled towards the opposite wall, instinctively raising our rifles. Chris screamed, covering his ears. Dave cursed through clenched teeth, his face a mask of fear and fury. George silently aimed his old but reliable double-barreled shotgun at the door. A second impact, harder than the first. We heard the crack of splintering wood somewhere near the doorframe. The latch bent under the monstrous pressure. A third blow struck the wall beside the door. The logs groaned. Old chinking and dust rained down between them. The creature outside clearly wasn't giving up. It was trying to break in with the persistence and force of a battering ram. We knew the door wouldn't last much longer. "Shoot!" Dave yelled, his voice cracking. "Wait!" I shouted back. "Don't waste ammo on the wood! Wait till it gets through!" My heart pounded wildly, palms sweating, the rifle stock slippery in my grip. The air hummed with tension. Then came the fourth, most devastating blow. With a deafening crash and splintering roar, not the door, but an entire section of the wall next to it. 2 or 3 logs burst inwards, scattering splinters and clouds of snowy dust. The bench we'd used to brace the door flew aside like a toy. Into the resulting breach, wreathed in swirling snow and clouds of its own breath, stepped a figure from a nightmare. It. Huge, easily 8 feet tall, even slightly stooped. Immensely broad shoulders covered in thick, dark, matted fur glistening with melting snowflakes. Powerful, muscular limbs ending in inhuman paws armed with long, black, sickle-shaped claws capable of rending steel. And the head. God, the head. An elongated canine or lupine muzzle filled with rows of sharp yellowish fangs protruding from black gums. Nostrils flared predatorily, tasting the air of the cabin, our scents. And the eyes. The eyes burned in the dimness of the breach with a yellow-orange malevolent fire. There was nothing animal in them, only cold, calculating fury. It was a dog man. The legend, the campfire horror story, the nightmare of the northern woods made real. It took another step inside, its claws scraping on the wooden floor. A low, menacing growl rumbled from its chest, forcing us further back against the walls. It slowly turned its head, its burning eyes scanning the dimly lit room. It was searching, but for what? Or whom? Us? Or the thing breathing beneath the floor? Its attention didn't seem focused on us, 4 terrified men with useless rifles. Its gaze was directed deeper into the cabin, towards the corner where the covered trapdoor lay. The creature knew. It knew someone else was here. Perhaps it had come specifically for it. We froze, afraid to breathe, knowing our lives hung by a thread, dependent on who or what this monster decided to target first. Just as the massive dogman took another step into the cabin, its attention fixed on the corner with the trapdoor. A furious snarl, filled with pain and hatred, erupted from beneath the floor. It was weaker than the intruder's roar, but no less savage. The planks covering the hatch and the logs we'd piled on top exploded upwards in a shower of splinters, as if blown out from within. From the black opening, staggering but rising to its considerable height, emerged a second dogman. It was noticeably smaller than the first, perhaps younger, or just a different build. Its dark gray fur was matted, torn out in patches, and heavily soaked with dark, almost black blood. A deep, ragged gash oozed on its flank, dripping crimson onto the floor, the source of the blood trail and the faint breathing we'd heard. Another wound marred its front leg. It was clearly limping. But despite its injuries, its eyes burned with the same untamed fury as its adversaries. Fangs were bared in a feral snarl, muscles tensed. It saw the intruder, and its entire posture screamed one thing, ready to fight to the death. The intruder roared again upon seeing its enemy. It clearly hadn't expected to find it here alive. Perhaps it had tracked it by the blood trail to the cabin, thinking it already dead or dying in the crawl space. The two monsters, ignoring us completely, launched themselves at each other with primal hatred. The cabin instantly became an arena for a gladiatorial combat of horrors. What followed was chaos, a whirlwind of roars, snarls, yelps, splintering furniture, and the sickening thud of heavy bodies colliding. They grappled in the center of the room, a rolling, snarling mass of muscle, fur, and claws. The table disintegrated under their weight. Benches were flung against the walls. The potbelly stove tilted dangerously, spilling hot coals from its open door. The air filled with the stench of blood, wet fur, and some primal, musky odor. Claw strikes left deep gouges on the walls and floor. The sounds of tearing flesh and, sickeningly, what might have been snapping bone mingled with the furious roars of the combatants. We pressed ourselves into the corners, trying to become invisible, shielding ourselves from flying debris and stray blows. Our rifles felt like useless toys against this titanic struggle. We were merely terrified bystanders at a battle to the death, a battle whose cause we didn't know, but whose outcome directly impacted our survival. The larger dogman was clearly stronger and heavier. It pressed the wounded one back, landing savage blows with its clawed paws, its fangs snapping, trying for a throat hold. The injured one fought back with the fury of the cornered, its movements fast but weakening. Blood poured from its wounds, staining the floor and walls crimson. It was clearly losing but refused to yield, fighting with the desperation of a doomed animal. The cabin shuddered from their struggle, the old logs groaning as if they might collapse at any moment, burying us and these horrors together. The fight was brutal and bloody, but the outcome became increasingly clear. The wounded dogman, bleeding profusely and losing strength, visibly weakened. Its movements slowed. Its attacks grew less precise. The larger monster, sensing its opponent's failing strength, threw its full weight onto it, pinning it to the floor amidst the cracking of floorboards. The wounded one whimpered in pain, struggling futilely. The victor roared in triumph, raised its massive head and prepared for the killing blow. Its enormous jaws opened, aiming for the throat of its downed foe. Another second, and it would be over. In that instant, icy terror gripped me, but a cold, clear thought cut through it. If that monster kills the second one, we're next. We'd be easy prey for it, tired but victorious. The instinct for self-preservation, the oldest and most powerful drive, overrode the paralyzing fear. The decision was instant, desperate. "Fire on the big one! Head, chest, fire!" I screamed, raising my rifle. My shout snapped the others out of their stupor. Dave, closest to the struggling creatures, reacted first. His heavy-caliber rifle cracked. The bullet slammed into the monster's massive chest or shoulder. It roared in pain and surprise, jerking violently. George's double barrel followed, a double blast of buckshot at close range into its broad back. I fired too, aiming for the head, but hitting its neck in the chaos. Chris, overcoming his terror, also emptied his carbine. The volley from 4 guns in the enclosed space deafened us. Gunpowder smoke mingled with dust and the steam rising from the monsters' bodies. The large dog man howled an unearthly sound, a mix of agony, rage, and astonishment. The bullets, even the heavy ones, hadn't killed it instantly. Its thick hide, powerful muscles, and bones were incredibly resilient. But the wounds, the shock, and the sudden attack from an unexpected quarter did their work. It staggered, losing its balance and loosening its grip on its enemy's throat. That moment of hesitation was fatal. The wounded dogman, sensing its chance, summoned its last reserves of strength. In a desperate, lightning-fast surge, it twisted and sank its fangs deep into the aggressor's throat, possibly into one of the wounds our bullets had made. A horrific, gurgling choke sounded. The big monster thrashed in agony, trying to shake off its attacker, but the grip was death itself. Blood spurted in fountains from the severed artery, drenching both creatures. The brief, violent death throes lasted only seconds. The large dogman's eyes rolled back, its body went limp, and it collapsed onto the floor beside its killer, raising a cloud of dust and splinters. The battle of titans was over. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. A deafening silence descended on the cabin, broken only by the heavy, ragged breathing of the surviving dogman, the crackle of dying coals in the stove, and our own choked gasps. The surviving monster stood over its vanquished foe, leaning heavily on its front paws. Its fur was matted with blood, its own and its enemies'. Blood dripped thickly from its fangs and lower jaw onto the floorboards, mingling with the pooling blood of the dead one. The wound on its side bled freely. It was clearly in great pain, but stood solid, a dark, wounded effigy of primal power. Then it slowly, very slowly, turned its head towards us. 4 men, frozen against the wall, smoking rifles in hand. Our faces were masks of horror, shock, and a strange exhaustion. Its eyes, not the yellow-orange of the first, but a dark brown, almost black, yet holding the same inhuman, intelligent gleam, met mine. For a fraction of a second, time stopped. In that absolute silence, thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder, hung an unspoken question. What now? Would it attack? Finish off the witnesses? Or, its gaze swept over our faces, Dave, Chris, George, then back to me. There was no gratitude in its eyes, nor threat. More like an assessment, an acknowledgement of our intervention. It saw the smoking barrels, smelled the gunpowder. It understood we had shot its enemy and perhaps our actions had saved its life. But it showed no emotion about it. Instead of attacking us, the humans who had just inadvertently aided it, albeit for our own survival, the dogman did something utterly unexpected and bizarre. It let out a low, guttural sound like a groan or growl of pain, then leaned down towards the body of its slain rival. With visible effort, it seized the massive carcass by the scruff of the neck with its teeth. The muscles in its neck and shoulders bulged with the strain. Laboriously dragging the dead weight across the blood-slicked floor, it turned. Then, limping heavily on its injured leg and leaving a wide, bloody trail behind it, it moved towards the gaping hole in the wall. It didn't look back. It simply exited the cabin back into the raging blizzard, hauling the corpse of its enemy with it. We watched it go, unable to move or speak. The swirling snow quickly swallowed its dark form and its gruesome burden. Why did it take the body? To eat it in seclusion? To hide the evidence of its presence and the fight? Or was it some animalistic ritual beyond our comprehension? The answer vanished with the wind and snow, leaving us alone with the wrecked cabin, the stench of death, and even more questions, adding layers of mystery and dread to the nightmare we'd endured. The forest returned to the roar of the storm, but now we knew it hid something far more profound than just cold and wild animals. We were alone, in the ruined, blood-soaked cabin reeking of death and fear. The shock slowly receded, replaced by fine, uncontrollable tremors and the heavy, nauseating realization of what we had just survived. Chris sat on the floor, head in his hands, weeping quietly, not from pain, but from sheer terror and nervous exhaustion. Dave, usually so boisterous and confident, silently sank onto the one intact bench, his face ashen gray, hands trembling so badly he could barely hold his rifle. George walked to the hole in the wall, staring out into the swirling snow, his face impassive, but his eyes held the shadow of something deeply felt. I felt utterly drained myself. The adrenaline dump left behind aching muscles and a dull headache. I noticed then that a flying piece of debris during the monster's fight had grazed my arm, a bleeding scratch. Dave found a couple of bruises and scrapes on himself too. Silently, mechanically, we treated our minor wounds with what was left of our first aid kit, using bandages and antiseptic. None of us slept that night. We sat huddled near the barely glowing stove, flinching at every howl of the wind, every creak of the logs, listening to the sounds outside, waiting for the wounded monster's return. But it never came back. Gradually, the blizzard's fury began to subside. By morning, the storm had passed as suddenly as it arrived. Pale, cold dawn light filtered through the hole in the wall and the grimy window. When it was fully light, we stepped outside the cabin. The world was transformed. Everything was covered in a thick, pristine layer of snow, sparkling under the low winter sun. The forest stood silent, peaceful, as if the night's horrors had never happened. But the signs remained. Around the cabin, the snow was heavily trampled by large paws, dark stains of blood visible here and there beneath the fresh dusting. A wide, bloody smear led from the breach in the wall deep into the woods, the trail of the departed dogman dragging its prize. Inside, the cabin was a scene of utter destruction and carnage. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the remnants of furniture. The smell was heavy, sickening. We looked at each other. The same thought was in everyone's eyes. Nobody would ever believe us. If we told this story, we'd be laughed at, dismissed as drunk or crazy. This tale would die here in this damned cabin, along with the smell of blood and fear. It would be our secret, our shared nightmare. Dave broke the silence first. "Pack up. Let's get out of here." No one argued. We silently gathered what remained of our gear, trying not to look at the evidence of the night's battle. Our rifles felt heavier now. We walked out of the cabin without looking back. We found our own tracks leading towards it and followed them back, navigating by the sun and the subtle signs only George could read. We reached the ATVs by evening, utterly exhausted, physically and mentally. We loaded our gear in silence, started the engines, and rode away from the forest that had become our own personal hell. Just before the woods disappeared behind a bend in the trail, I glanced back one last time. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink, blood-red snow. The forest looked calm and majestic, as it always had. But now I knew, we all knew, what primal, unfathomable darkness could hide beneath its serene, snowy blanket. That horror, that battle of titans, that silent gaze from the wounded monster. It would stay with us forever, an invisible scar on our souls. The forest keeps its secrets, and some of them are best left undisturbed. Story 2. The Pale Watcher of Trinity Alps. My name is Alexander Thorne, but the few who might call themselves friends call me Alex. Almost my entire adult life hasn't been spent within city walls, but under the open sky, in the heart of the wilderness. It's not just a hobby or a job. It's a fundamental part of who I am, almost a spiritual necessity. I'm a survival specialist, an explorer of those corners of the planet rarely touched by human feet. The noise and bustle of the city cause me physical discomfort. Concrete landscapes oppress me with their monotony. Only among ancient pines and firs, under the vast sky, listening to the song of the wind and rustle of leaves, do I feel truly whole, truly in my place. My skills are the result of years of practice. Building a fire in the rain, finding potable water where none seems to exist, navigating by stars or moss on trees, reading animal tracks like an open book. Solitude in the wild isn't a punishment for me, but a gift, a chance to tune into the rhythm of a world that existed long before us and will undoubtedly outlast us. I found information about the Canyon Creek Lakes Trail in the Six Rivers National Forest, deep within the Trinity Alps of Northern California, on one of those specialized forums for avid hikers where people share intel on little-known and challenging routes. A few obviously amateur photos and brief but awe-filled descriptions. The Trinity Alps beckoned with their wildness and inaccessibility. The nearest town of any significance, Redding or Eureka, was hours away by winding highways that turned into even slower, often rough forest roads. The Canyon Creek Trail itself was described as a serious challenge, demanding excellent physical condition and experience in mountain navigation. But the main draw was the destination, the high-altitude lakes and an overlook above them, which one trip report poetically called the Emerald Basin. Alpine lakes nestled in a granite cirque, their water in photos a deep, saturated blue-green, like liquid emerald or sapphire, cradled by gray cliffs. Naturally, I thoroughly researched all available data and warnings. The standards set for this region: challenging terrain with long climbs and rocky sections, sudden and drastic weather changes typical of high mountains. Sun could yield to icy wind and fog in minutes. Warnings about encountering black bears and the need for bear canisters for food. Mountain lions, unstable scree slopes, and slick granite slabs. The usual reminders to respect nature, leave no trace, be prepared for complete self-sufficiency. Cell service vanished long before the trailhead, all standard procedure. However, In a couple of old notes, found in scans of some local historical pamphlets, strange, vague phrases surfaced. Something about spirits of the high peaks, the need to show respect, that the Trinity Alps remember everything. Local tribes, Yurok, Karuk, Hupa, and their special relationship with these places were mentioned. I dismissed it as local folklore, echoes of ancient beliefs born from the harsh beauty and isolation of these mountains. Mountain spirits? To me, a pragmatist to the core, it sounded like nothing more than a pretty metaphor. Preparation was methodical and meticulous. I double-checked all my gear: waterproof breathable jacket and pants, down sleeping bag rated for freezing temps, lightweight but wind-resistant tent, navigation tools, compass, GPS navigator loaded with regional maps, satellite communicator for emergencies and brief check-ins, supply of high-calorie freeze-dried food for 5 days plus emergency rations, reliable water filter, comprehensive first aid kit, sharp knife, lightweight hatchet, signaling devices, powerful headlamp, and, absolutely essential, bear spray. Physically, I was ready, recent weeks dedicated to trail running and strength training. I registered my route and expected return date at the Six Rivers National Forest Ranger Station, left a detailed plan and checkpoints with my friend Michael, arranging for daily short check-ins via satellite. Everything was accounted for. The drive to the Canyon Creek trailhead took most of the day. The landscape changed outside the window. Highway 299 snaked along the Trinity River. Then narrow forest roads led further and further from civilization. Pavement turned to gravel, then packed dirt. The air grew clearer, the silence more palpable. The feeling of complete isolation grew, but it didn't frighten me. It filled me with anticipation for a real adventure. I was driving towards the wild, towards myself. The Canyon Creek trailhead was just a small, dusty parking area in the woods, a trampled clearing, an information board with a map and wilderness regulations. Besides my SUV, there were a couple of other cars, but no people in sight, likely hikers who had started earlier or were on multi-day trips. My vehicle seemed alien here. I got out, inhaling deeply the clean mountain air, rich with the scent of Jeffrey pine, Douglas fir, damp earth, and something else. The elusive fragrance of ancient rock and altitude. Before me rose the slopes of the Trinity Alps. Their granite peaks, some still snow-capped even in summer, looked like stern, indifferent giants guarding age-old secrets. The raw, untamed beauty of the place inspired awe. This was exactly what I had been seeking. Hoisting the familiar weight of my pack onto my shoulders, I stepped onto the trail. The first few hours of the hike passed at a brisk, steady pace. The path wound along the rushing Canyon Creek, sometimes climbing the slope, sometimes descending to the water's edge, crossing it several times on log bridges or stepping stones. I walked through dense forest dominated by massive firs, pines, and cedars, their crowns merging high overhead. The physical exertion felt good, warming my body. My lungs greedily drank the pure air, and the surrounding views were a constant delight. Rapids on the creek, moss-covered rock outcroppings, bright patches of wildflowers in the undergrowth. The sounds of nature created a soothing symphony. The rush of water, the sharp calls of Steller's jays, the busy chipping of chipmunks, the drone of insects, the whisper of wind in the high branches. I felt strong, confident, fully immersed in the present moment. Here, far from the clamor, I was home. The change happened unexpectedly about 4 or 5 hours into the hike. I had just stopped for a short break near a picturesque cascade on the creek to refill my water bottle and eat a nut bar. At first, I registered the shift subconsciously. Something felt off in the familiar soundscape. The jays fell silent. Then I realized I couldn't hear chipmunks or the buzz of insects anymore. Even the creek seemed muffled, and then the wind in the treetops died down. Silence descended, not gradually, but almost instantly, as if someone had thrown a soundproof blanket over the valley. This wasn't just the quiet of a remote place. It was an active, oppressive absence of sound. A vacuum. The air felt thick, still, heavy. The granite walls of the canyon seemed to amplify the stillness. Instinct, honed by thousands of hours in the wild, kicked in. I froze, listening intently with my whole body. My first thought was a sudden weather change, an approaching storm, though the sky above the canyon rim remained clear. Or maybe a large predator was nearby, a mountain lion whose presence could silence everything around it. I slowly stood up, carefully scanning the surroundings. Tree trunks, dense thickets on the slopes, dark crevices in the rocks. Nothing suspicious. No tracks, no movement. But the feeling that something was deeply wrong intensified. This silence was too absolute, too pervasive. And then I felt it. A slight but persistent prickling on the back of my neck. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't coming from a specific point, but seemed to emanate from the air itself, from the unmoving shadows, from the silent granite boulders. The mountains were watching, and I suddenly felt acutely aware of myself, not just as a hiker, but as an intruder, trespassing in someone else's domain. The local folklore, the spirits of the high peaks. Those thoughts no longer seemed like mere fairy tales. Something here was wrong, terribly wrong. I forced myself to move on. An inner voice honed by years of survival experience screamed danger, urging me to turn back immediately. But the lure of the Emerald Basin and a stubbornness that wouldn't let me retreat from the inexplicable pushed me forward. The initial enthusiasm, however, had vanished without a trace, replaced by a heavy, oppressive foreboding, a sticky fear I tried vainly to rationalize away. The silence, this dead, absolute silence, turned the ascent into a trial for the nerves. Every step I took on the rocky path echoed unnervingly loud. The creak of my pack sounded deafening, like scratching on glass. My own breathing seemed noisy and ragged, and the beat of my heart thudded powerfully in my chest like a giant metronome counting down moments in this soundless void. I felt incredibly exposed, out of place, a violator of ancient peace. The feeling of an unseen, intense gaze didn't fade. It became almost physically palpable, as if invisible eyes tracked my every move from behind rocks, from behind the trunks of the red firs and lodgepole pines that became more dominant as I gained elevation. I tried not to glance around constantly, forcing myself to watch the trail, but my peripheral vision kept catching fleeting movements in the deep shadows, movements that dissolved the instant I turned my head. The landscape around me, majestic in its stark beauty, granite peaks, steep scree slopes, sparse patches of green, began to take on sinister undertones. Shadows seemed unnaturally dark, inky, as if hiding more than just the absence of light. Twisted, wind-battered pines on the ridges resembled gnarled figures observing me. Granite cliffs seemed to form frozen, watching faces. Even the air felt thicker, resisting my progress. I walked for several more hours, almost on autopilot, lost in anxious thoughts and the struggle against rising panic. My destination, the Canyon Creek Lakes area and the overlook, had to be close now, according to the map and altitude. The sun began to dip towards the west, painting the sky and granite peaks in cold pink and lilac hues, which only intensified the oppressive sense of unreality. Finally, I reached my planned campsite, a relatively flat area among granite boulders and scattered, stunted pines, not far from the shore of the lower Canyon Creek Lake. I'd covered most of the distance, 8 or 9 hours of grueling ascent, Fatigue settled deep in my muscles, but my nerves were stretched taut like wires. Dropping my pack felt dizzying. Maybe the altitude, maybe the nervous strain. Here, in this open granite bowl surrounded by stern peaks, the silence seemed even denser, more deafening. I unscrewed the cap of my water bottle to take a drink. My hand trembled slightly. It was then, in that absolute crushing silence, with only the thumping of my own heart for sound, that I heard it. A sharp, dry noise, like a twig snapping or maybe rock scraping against rock, tore through the dead quiet. It sounded shockingly loud in the still air, like the crack of a whip. Very close, slightly behind and to my side, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. Too close. My reflexes, honed by years of training and real encounters in the wild, reacted faster than thought. I instinctively dropped into a crouch, spinning towards the sound. My heart plummeted, then instantly began racing, pounding in my temples. My hand automatically went to my hip, fingers finding the cold plastic of the bear spray canister, but some deep, primal part of my mind already knew. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't an animal of this world. And then I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, where the granite slabs gave way to scattered rocks and sparse bushes. The lengthening shadows of sunset partially obscured it, but the figure was distinct enough. The creature was impossibly tall, 8 feet at least, and incredibly sickeningly thin. A skeleton draped in skin. Its skin, stretched taut over sharp bony prominences, was a deathly pale ashen color, seemingly thin and almost translucent, like old parchment. It stood on 2 legs, but its entire posture was somehow wrong, angular, its subtle movements jerky and disjointed, like a broken marionette. Its head was small compared to its body, tilted slightly to one side in a pose of perpetual question or unending sorrow. But the eyes riveted my gaze, paralyzing my will. Huge, utterly black, with no whites, irises, or pupils. Just 2 deep voids that didn't reflect light, but seemed to radiate an infinite, ancient grief. They were set unnaturally wide and dominated the other facial features, which were essentially non-existent. Instead of a mouth, there was only a thin, vertical slit. As I watched, this slit parted slightly, revealing several rows of thin, needle-like teeth, dark, almost black. It resembled nothing I had ever seen. Not the maw of a beast, nor a human mouth. Something alien, insectoid. The creature's arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees. The fingers thin, bony, ending in what looked like long, jagged claws made of a dark, dully gleaming material, resembling obsidian. Its lower body, legs, and feet remained indistinct, blurred, as if viewed through a faint haze or the heat shimmer above hot pavement. It was difficult to focus on them. They seemed to vibrate on the edge of perception. I was frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and astonishment, unable to look away from those bottomless black eyes. The creature made no aggressive moves. It simply stood there watching me. Time slowed, thickening into a viscous sludge. There was no malice or threat in its gaze in the conventional sense. There was the weight of ages, a profound cosmic sorrow, and a clear warning. I felt not just like an intruder, but a desecrator. Someone who had blundered into a sacred, forbidden place, disturbing an ancient peace. The tension became almost unbearable. It broke in the most absurd, most human way possible. I sneezed, loudly, involuntarily. The sound echoed off the granite walls, sounding blasphemous in the dead silence. The creature's head snapped towards me. The vertical mouth slit opened slightly wider. A sound emerged from the depths of its gaunt frame, low, guttural rumbling like giant stones grinding deep underground, like the whisper of boulders tumbling in a mudslide. One word, spoken in an unknown tongue, yet its meaning struck my brain with absolute clarity on an instinctive level. Natel. Leave. Turn back. You don't belong here. The creature gave a slight, sharp nod or jerk of its head forward, reinforcing its silent command. It didn't feel like a direct threat of immediate violence, more like an insistent, almost mournful warning. An ancient guardian, weary of its endless watch, asking me to leave before it was too late. Primal, irrational terror flooded my consciousness, washing away all layers of civility, training, and self-control. Only one instinct remained, the most ancient flea: escape. I stumbled backward, tripped on a rock, nearly fell. I don't remember making the decision. It was instant, instinctive. Abandoning everything. My pack with the tent, sleeping bag, food, most of my gear. I turned and bolted. In my panic, I didn't even think about the GPS or map. I grabbed only the water bottle that was in my hand and the bear spray still clutched in the other. For the first few hundred yards, I sprinted down the trail, heedless of the path, fueled by pure adrenaline, leaping over rocks and roots. It was a desperate, blind flight. I stumbled, slid on loose scree, branches whipped across my face and arms, leaving stinging scratches. My lungs burned, breath tearing out in harsh, ragged sobs. The dead silence still hung in the air, but now it seemed even more sinister because I knew what caused it. That back there in the Emerald Basin remained something not of this world. Paranoia sharpened my senses to an excruciating degree. Every rustle, every twig snapping underfoot made my heart seize with terror. I kept casting frantic glances over my shoulder but saw nothing. The trail behind me was empty. Yet the feeling of being watched, the heavy, sorrowful gaze of those bottomless black eyes never left me. It bored into my back, preventing me from slowing down. Only after a couple of hours of frantic descent, when my strength was nearly gone, did the sounds begin to return. Tentatively at first, the distant murmur of the creek, then the rustle of wind in the firs, the sharp cry of a Steller's jay somewhere on the slope. The return of normal forest sounds should have brought relief, but instead, it only highlighted the ghastly unnaturalness of the absolute silence I had endured for the past few hours. It became irrefutable proof of the reality of the nightmare. The descent to my SUV turned into an exhausting marathon on the verge of physical and nervous collapse. I ran, shifted to a fast walk, ran again, pausing only for moments to gulp water frantically from my bottle. When, in the gray pre-dawn light, I finally saw the familiar shape of my vehicle in the dusty parking lot at the trailhead, a wave of such overwhelming relief washed over me that my legs buckled. Mixed with the profound terror and disbelief at what had happened, the feeling was almost unbearable. I yanked the door open, practically fell into the driver's seat, slammed it shut, and frantically hit the central locking button. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I sat there for several minutes, shaking uncontrollably, trying to catch my breath and stop my teeth from chattering, staring in the rearview mirror at the dark, silent wall of the forest. Turning the key, I spun the SUV around sharply and slammed the accelerator to the floor, kicking up clouds of dust. I raced down the forest road, ignoring potholes and ruts, until the Trinity Alps were far behind me. The entire long drive home, I tried to find a rational explanation. Acute mountain sickness, hallucinations from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, a bizarre atmospheric phenomenon, an encounter with an undiscovered animal. But every attempt at self-deception shattered against the crystal clarity of the memory. The image of the creature, its impossible physique, the ashen skin, the bottomless sad eyes, and that guttural, grinding voice was forever seared into my mind. Back in civilization, in the seeming safety of my home, I started searching. Days and nights spent online scouring hiking forums, cryptozoology sites, databases of anomalous phenomena. Nothing. Not a single description, not one account that even remotely resembled what I had seen near Canyon Creek Lakes. So I delved into the history and ethnography of the region. I searched National Forest Service archives, read anthropological studies on the native peoples of Northern California, the Yurok, Karuk, Hupa, whose ancestors inhabited these mountains for millennia. And there, amidst old maps, anthropologists' field notes, and retellings of local legends, I began to find scattered references. Stories of a pale guardian of the high peaks, a sorrowful watcher of sacred lakes and passes deep within the Trinity Alps. These legends were often linked to unexplained disappearances of people who showed disrespect towards the mountains, ignored warning signs, or entered particularly revered areas forbidden to outsiders. In one old linguistic paper, I found confirmation. A sound similar to na-tell, in certain dialects of the Athabascan language family, to which Hupa belongs, could indeed mean a call to leave, to turn back. And then the pieces clicked into place. The creature's overwhelming sadness. Its warning, not an attack, the ancient legends of vanishings. I realized the Pale Watcher likely wasn't inherently hostile towards me. It was a guardian, doomed to an eternal vigil in these wild mountains. Perhaps its sorrow was for those who failed to heed its warning and perished in the icy lakes or snowbound passes. Or perhaps it mourned the very intrusion of humans into its untouched domain. The terror of encountering an unknown monster shifted into a different, deeper existential fear. The realization that in the wildest, most beautiful corners of our planet, in the very real Trinity Alps, there might exist forces and entities, ancient and incomprehensible, guarding their boundaries. I knew I could never prove or even coherently explain what I had seen. And I knew the memory of those bottomless, sorrowful black eyes would haunt all my future expeditions. An eternal reminder that some mysteries are best left untouched and some boundaries are not meant to be crossed by humankind.